Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of our Azure Masterclass. This is all about identity. I want to focus on some of the basics around identity, thinking about Active Directory and then Azure Active Directory and really how do they play together, thinking about conditional access, multi-factor authentication, and then privileged identity management. As always, if this is useful, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. Let's kind of dive into this. So why do we even need this identity thing? And it's really all about, for any service, I want to be able to apply the least possible amount of privilege, and ideally only when it's required. I don't want different services sharing some generic identity, because then I can't track and audit which application is doing what. And also that identity would have to have the sum of all privileges required for that group of apps. So any one in particular app would have more permissions than it really needed. So I need a way to be able to provide some unique way to identify each app, each user, each device, and then give it only the permissions that are actually required to do the job, least privilege. Now, that means I'm going to give those identities a certain set of actions, and in Azure Active Directory, we group actions into roles, and then we grant that role to an identity. Typically, at the entire scope for Azure AD, although we can apply it to a smaller scope, with Azure resources, there are many different places I can apply those roles. Could be at management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, even resources. I'm going to talk a lot more about that in the next module when we cover governance. But the whole point is I'm going to give those actions to certain identities at a certain scope. So I can do these things for these groups of objects. Now I'm going to focus on the security principles in this module. Again, using them I'm going to cover more in the governance module. Now, the whole point of this is any actor, again, app, Azure resource via managed identity, user, should be uniquely identifiable. If I'm creating some new service and I find, hey, I'm going to use this generic identity for this service, this service, this service, or hey, I'm going to have these 10 users share this account, that's generally a bad thing because I have no way to audit what any particular actor, i.e. real world object, is doing in that service. The only way I can really track it is by the identity they authenticate with. Now, to do this, to have these set of identities, I require a central store. So I need some store where I have all the identities, that maybe I have passwords in there, and then I have different types of resource trust that identity. So if it can do authentication and authorization, it's an identity provider, and things will trust it. Office 365 tenant, hey, I trust a certain Azure AD. Azure subscriptions trust a certain Azure AD tenant. So I'm going to group all of these together, and then it's going to give me certain capabilities to actually let me use them. So again, I have to be able to authenticate that identity stored in the identity provider. Maybe it then does authorization. So enter Azure AD. So Azure AD is the identity provider for really all of the Microsoft clouds. So if we think about for a second, hey, look, I create an Azure AD tenant. So each company is going to have its own Azure AD instance. That's going to be some name by default .onmicrosoft.com. And then I could, if I wanted to, add a custom name. Maybe I call it name.com, name.org, whatever that is. But that is my Azure AD instance. That's where I'm going to put my objects. Now, from that, I might have things like an Office 365 instance that will trust a certain Azure AD, And then all of those identities can be given access to resources in Office 365. I might have over here an Azure subscription. Again, each Azure subscription trusts one and only one Azure AD instance. So this trust, so then the resources in that subscription, the resource groups, the resources, the subscription itself, all of the identity and access management, the ACLs on things, will use the identities. Again, it could be users, it could be kind of groups of users, it could be special types of identities, will come from that Azure AD there. Could be other applications. So the whole point of Azure AD is it talks cloud. It talks things like OpenID Connect. It does authorization using OAuth 2. It speaks SAML and WS Fed. So if I had any other kind of app that I was writing, well, my app could be configured to trust and use this Azure AD for its authentication. So the whole point of Azure AD is it speaks cloud and it's going to store those identities for me. But that's the point. You're going to have probably one main tenant and you're going to populate it with your identities, and then your cloud services, certainly the Microsoft ones, are going to trust it. But also I can have many, many other types of software as a service solutions, maybe even PaaS. They can go and trust and use it as well. When we talk about things like federation, it's all about trusting and using that identity provider. So obviously Azure, Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, the Power Platform, they're always going to use an Azure AD. Now, Azure AD is not the same as Active Directory domain services in the cloud. This is super important to understand. So many people kind of say, oh yeah, I already know Azure AD. It's just kind of AD running in Azure, because it's very logical. That's what the name says, but it's completely wrong. If we think about AD, well, AD is this great thing that we kind of run on premises. We created one or more domains in a forest, a tree, whatever that might be. They were personified through domain controllers. I could think about, well, I have a kind of certain network here, and I could have machines. This is some server. I could have kind of workstations, and they all had kind of a secret. They joined the domain. And the way I used this is I would use DNS. Often these domain controllers also hosted kind of DNS services. DNS was used for the location. That's how I found domain services. I would look up, hey, I need _LDAP._TCP.the domain. That's how I found a domain controller. Then I would talk to it on lots of different protocols. So AD was all about things like Kerberos. It was all about things like NTLM. It was things like LDAP, ADSI. So it spoke things that worked on premises, because I had a whole range of ports open, and I had things that trusted the Active Directory. So there was a secret. Each machine actually kind of has a password stored in the Active Directory. And then of course I had users in here. I had groups in the Active Directory. I had my machines. I had things like group policy, very, very rich controls built in there. I had a structure. So in Active Directory, I had organizational units. I could have this very deep tree of OUs on how I structured things. Then at the OU level, I could delegate permissions, so someone could have permissions over a certain subset of the objects. I could apply group policy, so I set policies based on where the object was in it. So that's AD. Azure AD has nothing to do with that. There's AD in the title. That's really as much in common as they have. Azure AD does not speak Kerberos or NTLM or LDAP. I do not join things in that traditional sense to Azure AD. Azure AD does not have group policy. Azure AD doesn't really have things like organizational units. It is a flat structure. Azure AD is designed for cloud authentication, cloud authorization. AD was designed really for that on-premises resources within a network. Now, really why we like Azure AD is because companies started to use these SaaS things. So, hey, there's all these SaaS services out there. And right now, my users have accounts on premises in my Active Directory. Great. Now I want to use this SaaS service. And we got stuck because one option, imagine I had user Bob here. Well, I could create a completely separate account for Bob over here in that SaaS service. But now imagine I have 20 of them. That was bad for everyone. It's bad for the SaaS service because they now have to maintain a set of identities. They have to maintain the ability to reset the passwords. So it's kind of bad for the SaaS provider. It's bad for Bob because he now has to remember a different set of credentials in that SaaS provider. And it's bad for my company because if Bob leaves my company, how do I easily deactivate his permission, or her permission, probably not Bob, to that SaaS service? So it was bad for my company as well. I couldn't guarantee the security, so I don't want separate credentials in every SaaS service I use. So what came about was federation. Federation was really based around SAML, AWS Fed. And what federation let me do is I could use my home realm identity with those SaaS services. So great, I would establish this kind of federation between them. So I have this kind of federation. And now that home identity could be projected into that SaaS service through claims. Now I'm drawing a line, but the reality is they never talk to each other. When Bob tried to access the service, Bob would get a token with claims from his federation server and then send that to the SaaS service. There's no online communication between my identity provider and that service. So this works, but the challenge of this is, well, I have to maintain a whole bunch of internet-facing services for the federation. I have to create the federations. I have to work out what claims I'm going to put. I have to work out the certificates I'm using. So one of the things about Azure AD is Azure AD has loads and loads of these kind of federations built in. So I don't have to go and do that. So one of the biggest features of Azure AD was all about, hey, look, it will be that federation broker. If I go and quickly just look at, let's look at, for example, my enterprise applications for a second. I'm going to add a new application. If I go and look at this gallery, you can see there's 3,600 applications in the gallery. There are ones in here that are kind of showcase ones. These support true federation. They support things like actually creating the objects on the other side if they're required for things like SCIM. If I have an app that's not in the gallery, hey, I can go and add a non-gallery application, and then I can say, hey, I can use a SAML based, I can use that SCIM for provisioning on the other side. I can still add it even if it's not in the gallery. If I'm creating my own app through OpenID Connect, through OAuth2, through SAML, I can add it into here. So I have all these kind of great capabilities that I can easily add. I can even project an application from on-premises through Azure AD App Proxy. Azure AD App Proxy is all about the idea that, hey, I've got some application running here. I want to make it internet facing. What I can actually do is there's kind of an agent, the app proxy that I install. It opens up an outbound connection over 443, and I can then advertise the app out to the internet through that connection, and I can actually use that to go and actually get to the app. I can pre-auth using things like OAuth2, OpenID Connect, and it's using Kerberos on the back end. So there's a ton of things it can do, but it's all about taking my existing identity and now making it available to the cloud in a seamless way. That's the goal of Azure AD. And yes, there's a whole bunch of these federations. You saw that 3,600 that are built in, but it's going to layer on top of all of these things the idea about authorization. And that's a really, really important thing. I'll talk more about this in a second. But on top of all of these different services that trust, something you'll hear me talk about a lot is something called conditional access. The ability to evaluate what I'm trying to do and then set conditions. So, hey, yes, I could have separate identities. It's hard for me to track. It's hard for me to know the security. If I use my one identity and expand it to the cloud, through conditional access, I can have a consistent view. I can see what's being used. But I can also now use things like conditional access to say, hey, look, this is a sensitive app. I need you to be on a hybrid joined machine that's healthy. That health state comes from Intune, for example. Or, I've detected some enhanced risk. I want you to do an MFA, a multi-factor authentication. So I now get this centralized set of authorization controls, no matter what app I'm using, by bringing in this kind of central identity. So that's kind of a big driver. So hopefully that kind of makes it clear. Azure AD is not AD in the cloud at all. There really is almost no similarity. They're both identity providers, but that's about it. Now, there are many different SKUs of Azure AD and the way I license them. So if I jump over for a second to the portal, and if I go and look, what we kind of see is we'll see there's a free SKU, a kind of SKU I get if I have Office 365, and then Premium P1 and Premium P2. Now, most of the time, you won't just buy Premium P1 or P2 on its own. You're going to maybe purchase the Enterprise Mobility Suite, EMS, you're going to purchase Microsoft 365, and depending on the version you buy, it comes with an Azure AD Premium P1 or a P2. Like the E3s often have P1, the E5s often have P2. Now, I license these on a per user, per month basis. It doesn't have to be all the same. So I might have some users using the free SKU. Some users, they're going to have P1. Some users can have P2. Now, you may have everyone as P2. You may have everyone as P1. But the point is, depending on the role and the features you need, you may actually license them slightly differently. Now, there's a whole set of different capabilities, and I'm not going to go through every single one. It would take too long. But we want to kind of highlight a few of the key ones. When we think about directory objects, so with free, there's a 500,000 object limit. As soon as we go to even Office 365, as soon as I have that enabled for a tenant, the object limit goes away. Office 365 actually writes a lot of things to Azure AD, so that object limit goes away. That's not users, remember, that's objects. There are many different types of objects that live in Azure AD. Single sign-on. So even with free, I can do single sign-on. If I kind of have an account, for example, and what that's going to give me is things like, hey, I've got my account, I've extended it from AD to Azure AD, I can authenticate. I don't have to go and authenticate again when I try and use Azure AD. My on-premises authentication I've already performed will extend out to Azure AD. Federated applications, remember I drew the line at 3600 or ones I add, hey, I can do those for ADFS or sort of third-party IDP. I can create users in the cloud. I can do user group management for cloud users. I can register devices. For the authentication, I can do pass-through authentication, password hash sync, seamless SSO. I can use Azure AD Connect. So Azure AD Connect is all about the idea that, remember I drew this kind of AD on premises, and we have this Azure AD up here. Remember, the point is I want to extend. I want to take this AD and extend it to the cloud. And so Azure AD Connect is the thing that is going to actually take objects from on-premises and replicate them to the cloud. So even the free version, I can take my users on-prem and extend them out to the cloud. So basically the way this works is it kind of has kind of a connector space for my AD, a connector space for Azure AD, a metaverse where it kind of joins them together. There are rules I can create, but essentially it's going to project and create the objects in Azure AD. The objects in Azure AD have kind of a source anchor that ties it to a particular AD object, and that's how they're related going forwards. So even with free, I don't have to buy anything. I can take my objects and I can project them up into Azure AD and pick kind of that single sign-on. If it's a cloud user, so remember the point of a cloud user is I created it directly in the cloud. It's not a user, let's say Bob here, that I replicated up through Azure AD Connect. If I actually just directly created the user in Azure AD, that's a cloud user. It's not sourced, it's not origin from somewhere else. So that is a cloud user. So if it was created in Azure AD, even with free, well, I can do things like a self-service. They can change their password. I can do things like Azure AD join. I can use the global password protection. So there are certain passwords that are just so common, no one should use them. It won't let you use them, even for free. And there's some basic reports, and there's some basic MFA. If I turn on security defaults, and I'll talk about this more later on, it will make you do MFA if I do things like access the portal or PowerShell or the CLI. But I don't really have any control around that. Then if I have Office 365, well, I can do some company branding. I can customize the look of the sign-in. I can have a different background. I can set some kind of text that I want to display. So I can customize the experience. If I went and jumped over and I went to my Azure AD and I actually go and look at company branding, well, I've kind of look at this. You can see I've changed the background picture. I've set a logo. I set some miniature icons. So all of those things would actually now be shown when someone goes to actually authenticate to my Azure Active Directory instance. So that would actually go and show up. So as long as I've got Office 365, I can actually go ahead and customize that experience. I get an SLA, etc. But then we get to kind of the premium features. And in most enterprises, you're going to probably want P1. And the really big thing about P1, honestly, is MFA. And I can drive the MFA through conditional access. I'm going to talk a lot more about this later on. But now I can say, hey, I require MFA based on these conditions, based on these things happening. It also gives me things like I can do a self-service password reset in the cloud, and it will actually write the password back to on-premises. Ordinarily, the flow is from AD to Azure AD. AD is always the source of truth. By default, I can't create objects in Azure AD and they will replicate back. There are things I can write. I can write things with MIM and other tools that it can detect an object and create an object in AD, but that's not how it typically works. AD is the source of truth and things flow that way. Now, what I can do with Premium is I could change my password up here and it will actually go and change it back in AD. I could forget my password up here. I could do a self-service password reset against Azure and it will update my password down here. Now, the way it's actually working is it talks to kind of Azure AD Connect, says, hey, Azure AD Connect, I need the password changed. Azure AD Connect talks to the domain controller, changes the password, and then if I'm replicating it to the cloud, then it goes and replicates the changed password. So even if I'm doing password change in Azure AD, it doesn't replicate the password change downwards. It goes and talks to a special component in Azure AD Connect who changes the password against the domain controller, and then it can replicate up if I'm replicating hashes of hashes to Azure AD. So I get those features. Oh, where's my portal gone? Oh, there we go. So there's two of the big ones. There's many other capabilities. I can manage groups. I can be made an owner of a certain group. And now through the portal, myapps.microsoft.com, I can go and do group management, add users. I can make it so users can request to join my group. I can go and discover apps that are being used in my enterprise. I can have advanced security reports. I can use Azure AD App Proxy. I get Connect Health that shows me, hey, that Azure AD Connect, my actual Active Directory. Hey, if I'm using Federation, are those things actually healthy? Are they running as anticipated? If I jump over, I can actually go and say, hey, look, here's my Azure AD Connect. Well, I can see my Azure AD Connect is running, all good stuff there. But if I actually go and search for health, I see I've got Azure AD Connect Health. It actually gives me a lot more information. Here you can see, hey, I can look at the detail of my sync services. I could look for any kind of sync errors across all the different types of objects. I can actually see, is my Active Directory domain services healthy? And I can actually drill down, it's got agents running. I can see the exact details of my on-prem AD. If I was using Federation ADFS, it would show me data around that as well. So it's really given me a lot of really good information. So that's part of that premium P1 and above. I get dynamic groups. I can create a group based on a query. It's not live, but it's constantly kind of reevaluating. So based on that rule, it will go and add users into a group. I can do static assigned as well. It's a different type of group. There's a whole bunch of different group capabilities. You'll see conditional access. I have the Azure Information Protection Integration, SharePoint Limited Action, terms of use. These are pretty cool. Have to agree to this PDF document before I can go and use something. Then the MFA with conditional access. Then we get to the P2. So things like identity protection. Hey, based on this sign-in, I can give a certain risk. Based on my overall user session, a certain risk. And then use that as part of conditional access. So that's a P2 feature. Identity governance, privileged identity management. That's the idea that I get a certain role, but not all of the time. I can elevate up, so it's just in time. I activate, I get the permission for a period of time, and then I lose it. Access reviews, checking, do I need this role, this group membership, this app? And someone could be delegated to do that. It could be an administrator. It can be a self-review. Then entitlement management, get packages of SharePoint sites and group memberships and app assignments that people can actually go and request, and they get it for a period of time based on maybe an approval flow. So there's all these different SKUs. And so basically, you'll look at the features and you'll say, okay, well, this group of users, they could just use free. Hey, I've got Office, so everyone gets those rights. These people, hey, I really want the more granular MFA with conditional access, they need P1. These people, the identity protection, the PIM, the access reviews, need P2. Now, if you're a big organization, a lot of times you'll want the P2. The P2 has a lot of that real enterprise level protection, the privileged identity management, the identity protection, the access reviews, the entitlement packages. They're all big things, but obviously it costs you more money. You have to kind of weigh up the reward and the con of the cost. But again, if you have like an EMS or Microsoft 365, often those licenses will really just be part of it. So there's all these different SKUs, but again, it's per user per month. You pick the one that makes sense for that particular group of users. So how do you get Azure AD? Well, the chances are you have it already. If you have Office 365, if you're using Intune, if you have an Azure subscription, you have an Azure AD. It's managed through Azure or Office. So if I'm really just an Office user, I can just go to kind of the Office 365 portal and do basic management of users and groups and licensing through the Office portal. I can also use the Azure portal, which is what I'm doing. There's also a special, there's an Azure AD portal.azure.com, which just focuses on the Azure AD parts of the portal. So if I actually jump over for a second, so if we go to this portal right here, if I actually go and add a new tab up at the top here, and I'll just type in aad.portal.azure.com because they've done it in the past. So this is really a lot of the same things that we saw in the Azure AD under the Azure portal, but it's just focused on Azure AD. I can see my branding. I can see things like, hey, what is the highest level of Azure AD I have in my tenant, which is P2. I have some users licensed for P2. And then it's got things like the Connect Health, the governance. It just brings all the different things that are Azure AD specific to the forefront. So I can go and use this special aad.portal.azure.com to really focus on Azure AD things. But I could equally use the Azure portal. And again, the Office portal is kind of a simplified view of that. Now I can create additional Azure AD instances. This is always confusing to nearly every customer. Azure AD does not belong to an Azure subscription. There's always concerns about, hey, someone's going to go and create an Azure AD instance in my subscription and then they're going to do stuff to my subscription. They're completely different. Remember what the model was. I have services like Azure subscriptions trust Azure AD instances. Now, anyone can go and create an Azure AD instance. It doesn't live in a subscription. They kind of sit above everything else. So just because someone creates an Azure AD instance in my company doesn't mean my company is using it in any way. You have to move resources to trust that Azure AD subscription before it can do anything. Like imagine I had a company user in this Azure subscription. They created a new Azure AD. So they went ahead and they created a new Azure AD over here. John's AAD.onmicrosoft.com. I can't do anything with that. I would have to move resources to trust. Now, if I was an owner of the Azure subscription, I could move the subscription to now trust that Azure AD. And then it would use the accounts from here. But unless someone's an owner, I really can't move things to go and use other Azure ADs. But by default, really anyone can just go and create new Azure AD instances. It's just something, but it really doesn't mean anything. So if I went to the portal and I kind of just said, hey, create a resource. If I search for, let's just search for Azure Active. There's an Azure Active Directory. I can say create. I would enter a name. So let's say it's John's AAD. I could create that right now. Now I pick a geography because they are bound to a certain set of services, but for the most part, they're available everywhere. This is just where I'm picking to create it. And I would hit create. That's it. I don't have to do anything else. Oh, I need to copy that name, sorry. So I'd copy that into here. So it's gonna be John's AAD on Microsoft.com, hit create, and that would then exist. Once I go ahead and create those things, I could go and use it. So if I kind of click my name, I could switch directory, and I could go and switch directory to some other Azure AD. I've got others here that I'm using. And then I'd only see resources that trust that particular Azure AD instance. I'd have to move things. Like if I switch to this Savile Tech testing. So here we can see I've switched over, but I have no resources. And if I try and create something, I can't. Because I created a new Azure AD, but there are no subscriptions that trust it. I can't do anything useful with it. So just creating an Azure AD instance on its own really doesn't do very much. I'd have to actually have something trusting it to make any use. But that's how I can go ahead and create a new Azure AD. If I was doing testing, for example, I wanted to test some new features of Azure AD, I might go and create a test tenant. I want to test some OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and I'm messing around. I might go and create it for that reason. But there's nothing about it. If I went and created an Azure AD as my corporate account, then I went and created a new Azure subscription to pay as you go and linked it, that bill won't come back to my company. I'd have to go and put in my personal credit card, etc. Now, there might be governance challenges around that. So there are things we can do to restrict what you can do as my kind of corporate account. But just realize, hey, I can create other Azure AD instances. Doesn't really mean a lot on its own. So by default, the name is going to be something.onmicrosoft.com. I can go ahead and add a custom domain name. So you notice my name is saviletech.net. That's because I went to my Azure AD. I can actually go to custom domain names, and then I added saviletech.net. Now you have to verify, prove that you own that. You go and create a text record in the DNS zone. So that proves I own saviletech.net. It's then verified, and now I can actually use saviltech.net instead of saviltechlab.onmicrosoft.com, which was the default name when I created that zone. So if you're starting off completely fresh, you're going to want to go ahead and create an Azure AD tenant. It's going to be something.onmicrosoft.com. Then most likely you'd now want to go and add a custom name that probably matches what you're doing on premises. You probably have, normally it's your email alias, .company.com, whatever that will be. You go and validate you own this, make that available in the Azure AD before I start replicating objects or doing anything else. That would be kind of the first thing I'd want to go and set up. Okay, so the types of objects, obviously there's users. As I talked about before, they can be objects, users that replicate from my AD. They can be native users that I create in the cloud. And I'll see that if I go and actually look at my Azure AD and I go and look at my users, I can see the creation type. I can see if it was directory synced. So I can see no, they're all cloud ones. And I can see yes for some of my users here. So you can actually notice this column over here. So right here, we can see directory synced. So I can see some are no, some are yes. Ones that yes, they came from AD. The others, hey, I created those just in the cloud. So I see those different bits. And they've kind of changed some of the naming they've used on here. I can see some are guests. They've kind of come from external places. Maybe it's another Azure AD. Maybe it's a Microsoft account. Maybe it's some one-time passcode, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I can kind of see, hey, is this a cloud native, or is it actually been synced for Active Directory? If we go and look at columns, I can go and see some maybe other things I want to show. So we have users. Then we have groups. These can again be assigned. I'm setting who's in the group. It can be dynamic. I set some rule that says, hey, based on this attribute, if you have this particular attribute, then you're a member of the group. It could be maybe a department. It could be saying in your title, whatever I want. I can use that to drive group membership. Enterprise applications, they have service principals in my Azure AD. Azure resources, a virtual machine. Many other types of object, they can have an identity in Azure AD. It's called a managed identity. And what that allows me to do is within that particular Azure resource, and only that resource, I can act as that identity to authenticate and then be authorized to use other resources in Azure. So rather than having to try and store some credential, hey, I'm running in this container or this app service panel, this function, I can go and connect and use this storage account or this Cosmos DB without having to go and store a credential somewhere. As the resource itself, I can go and authenticate and be given access via the access control to that resource. Devices, other stuff, there's various types of metadata, there's all these different things. The key point is your users and groups will often come from AD, even my devices. I'm going to have a hybrid AD join, for example. Those will replicate as well. So there'll be known objects in my Azure AD. So the goal would be very rarely are we actually going to go ahead and create objects directly in Azure AD. Most of our objects will replicate. Now, as a best practice, one of the things that it is good to do is to kind of create a break glass account. I have some cloud account that the password is locked away somewhere, that if the worst of the worst happened, there was some attack against my AD and it locked all my accounts out for some reason, I could still break glass and get access to this kind of special privileged account. Now, because it's a privileged account, I want to be very careful with where I store that, but that is fairly common to create kind of this emergency account if something really bad happened. Now, there are capabilities in Azure that if I attacked Azure AD, maybe a denial of service attack to try and lock out all the accounts, it actually won't lock out the AD accounts. It will lock out the AAD account and then stop any future attacks for a period of time. to protect against locking out the AD. So there are things in Azure AD that would protect a denial of service attack against AAD and lock out your AD accounts. So that's kind of just saying that's built in, and you can tweak those settings. That is natively available. Okay, so authentication, authorization. Now remember, they're two very, very different things. Authentication is about proving I am, or the app is, who they say they are. Traditionally, we think about using a password, but now we think about other things like maybe some biometric or other things. It's proving you are who you say you are. Authorization comes after authentication to say, well, then this is what that proven identity is allowed to do on this scope of resources. So authenticate, and then we're authorized to do stuff. So for Azure AD, there is cloud and federated authentication. We can authenticate to Azure AD actually in different ways. So the first and the recommended is password hash. And it's recommended because there are things Azure AD can do to help protect you. If it has the password hash, it goes and trawls the dark web. If it finds leaked credentials, it can compare the leaked credential on the dark web with the hash it has and says, well, it's the same, your credentials leaked, and it could then make an MFA and make you change your password. It can give you certain types of protection. Now, this used to be called password sync, which was a terrible name. It never synced the password. The whole point of this, start a new picture, is I can think about, well, I have my Azure AD, and in this case, I've kind of got my Active Directory. Remember, we have our user, and it has 4 arms apparently, and it has a password hash. And we're using Azure AD Connect to replicate the object. Now, optionally, we can replicate the hash of the hash. This is not the original hash. It takes the hash and then it runs it through kind of these 1,000 SHA iterations. There's a per user sort. It cannot be reversed. So it replicates the user, and then it stores, I keep drawing 4 arms, this kind of hash of the hash. Cannot be reversed. If I have that hash of the hash, if this user now actually wants to authenticate, well, they can actually authenticate directly against Azure AD. Azure AD has the user, it has the hash of the hash password, it can do the authentication, and it can just send them back, hey, kind of here's your refresh token and your access tokens. Doesn't have to do anything else. And this, because Azure AD is doing the authentication, it has other types of automatic protection. Like if it detects an authentication from known bad actors, it will just reject it, it will kill it off. So the benefits I get from actually doing this. Now this is by far the preferred approach. This kind of cloud authentication, this is our number one shining, do this. Now let's say you don't want to do this. Maybe I don't like the idea of having my hash of a hash is stored in Azure AD. It's normally a trust issue. It's not really a technical issue. These are stored more securely than anything you're doing in your Active Directory. It's not the original hash. I can't reverse it. But companies will have a hang up. So let's just say you're in that position. I don't want to have the hash up here. Now, there might be other reasons. There are a few things. For example, if my account gets locked out, it doesn't get locked out up here. If my password has expired, it doesn't make me change my password. So maybe if I have restricted logon hours, they're not enforced up here. If I need that, then what I could do is, well, I need to authenticate against my on-prem AD. So my second option is something called pass-through authentication. What happens is when I go to authenticate, what it actually does is it kind of writes an authentication request to a queue. And then I have one or more agents running on-prem that again establish an outbound kind of 443 connection to this. Don't have to open any ports. It sees, hey, look, there's an auth request. It grabs it, runs it against the DC, and then kind of sends back the yes, no, at which point There's my refresh token, an access token. But because it's authenticating against the domain controllers, if there are restricted hours, if it's locked out, if the password is expired, well, it's going to complain. So this would kind of be my second choice then, my pass-through authentication. For both of these, I can still do seamless sign-on. If I'm on a corporate joint device, on a corporate network, I can enable seamless sign-on, not single, different name, seamless sign-on. There's a few group policies to make certain URLs trusted. It will then seamlessly authenticate me. There's a third option. The third option comes back to early days, where we couldn't do seamless sign-on, and you would use federation. So remember previously I kind of drew these federation services. That is an option as well. I can federate Azure AD with some on-prem. So now when the user authenticates, we'll do another color. So the user comes into auth. Well, actually it now just sends a kind of a redirect. It would bounce the user to the federation service who will challenge them. At this point, they'll perform the security, whatever that is. They'll get kind of a token sent back to the user. The user would then send the token to Azure AD with the claims in, etc. And then they'd get their access token and refresh token. But this is doing the authentication. So once again, it would check those kind of logon hours, etc. There's actually a Microsoft document that goes through the authentication options. And the real bit I want to focus on right here is, if we quickly look here in this middle section, this is that part I was talking about. So the first column is just a regular hash sync. There's up to a 30-minute delay if there's a disabled account. But if I use the pass-through authentication, the second column, or I use federation, then any kind of disabled account, locked out account, is expired, the password is expired, sign-in hours, that's enforced, basically in real time, because the authentication has to go via the domain controllers. So if those things are important, then you can take one of those other factors. Now, I do want to stress one thing, because people look at that and go, yes, I need to know instantly if an account is disabled. The cloud works differently from kind of how we might be used to thinking about things, which means that instant knowledge that something's disabled might not be as important as you really think it is. If I think about, and I've got a whole separate video, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about this, but if I think about there's some kind of client app, there's some service I want to access, then there's Azure AD. When I try to access the service, it's going to kind of bounce back and says, give me a token. I need an access token. So, well, I haven't got one. The service knows the Azure AD it trusts. It will kind of bounce me there. It will make the user authenticate. At that point, when the authentication happens, it will send now back to the user, because you said, oh, okay, I've done the authentication. It will now bounce back and send the user the access token and the refresh token. At this point, I would send the access token to the service. That access token is good for 60 minutes. In that 60 minutes, there is almost nothing I can do to disable that. Now, there is some new things coming. There's something called continuous access evaluation. What that lets me do is certain services today, it's like Exchange and SharePoint. They can subscribe to kind of critical events from Azure AD and react a bit quicker. It allows it to actually reject even a valid token. But under pretty much any other circumstance, there's nothing I can do. It's at the point it requests. Now let's say that 60 minutes expires. What happens? I don't re-authenticate. All I do is I send to Azure AD, hey, here's my refresh token. I need a new token for the service. Azure AD says, okay, great, your refresh token's good. here's your new access token, and here's an updated refresh token. That's why refresh tokens essentially last forever. If I think it's 90 days, as long as I'm active within 90 days, they're going to keep extending that time window. And now I send my new access token that's been updated. If I try to access service 2, what do I have to do? I say, hey, Azure AD, I need a token. I send my refresh token for service 2. So it sends me back an access token for service 2. I'm not re-authenticating, and then I send that. Which is why, if your account is disabled, that instant knowledge really may not matter that much. The tokens are still good. And it's actually important to understand as well, if I do federation, people think, oh, I do federation. Federation will change that. It doesn't. All it changes is this initial authentication. There's kind of an extra step goes in to say, okay, well, it bounces by the federation, that gets a SAML token, and then that goes to here, and everything else carries on as normal. This never gets spoke to again until I have to completely reauth. So I can't do policy over here. Any policy I need done, this is where I can apply policy. This is the only thing that gets hooked into every time I request a new access token with Azure Active Directory. And that's conditional access. That's why conditional access is such a huge deal. And it's for this reason we really don't care that much for federation anymore. Federation used to be fantastic because it gave a single sign-on, but it's not unique in that anymore. And it's a whole bunch of infrastructure I have to maintain and care for really no benefit. Again, trying to do policy and federation wouldn't apply most of the time. I have to do my policy in Azure AD in conditional access because this is not called every time I do an authentication. I have to move it up the identity provider that the service is actually trusting. So federation, honestly, would be kind of the number 3. Federation, that'll be my least favorite option, just because the sheer amount of stuff. I have to have internet-facing services. I have to maintain all of these things. And again, it's not really buying me anything. If I had to have that restricted hours, I can use partial authentication. That's a much cleaner, smaller footprint than anything else I have to do there. And again, I always have Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect only ever have one active. I can have a second Azure AD Connect in a standby mode to kind of flip over if something bad happened. But honestly, if Azure AD Connect is down for a little bit of time, it's not the end of the world, particularly. Obviously, new objects won't get replicated. If I'm doing the password hash sync, that stuff wouldn't happen. So I can have a standby, but generally I can stand this up again really, really quickly. So that's why it's just a single instance is doing stuff, but I can have a standby Azure AD Connect as well. Okay, so we can have the password hash, we can have pass-through authentication, and we can have federation. Even if I'm doing PTA or federation, still send the hash of the hash. Because if one of these things broke, let's say I have a denial of service, I have some WannaCry that takes out my on-prem infrastructure, do you really want your globally available Azure AD that's available throughout the world dependent on something you have running on-prem? If something attacks and knocks out PTA, knocks out on-prem, knocks out your federation service, now everything that trusts Azure AD doesn't work either. So at least, even if you're using one of those other things, still send the hash of the hash, and then it's a break glass. If something bad happened to these, I can flip a switch in Azure AD and change to hash sync, cloud authentication. Then everything that trusts Azure AD would carry on working. I can still get to Office 365, I can still get to my Azure resources. So still send the hash. I could still have things like identity protection, finding leaked credentials. There really is not a reason to not send the hash of the hash. Again, it's not the hash, it's a hash of the hash, 1,000 SHA iterations, a per user sort. It cannot be reversed. It's a really good thing to have. Hopefully I've stressed that. So that's kind of the options. And you generally do it in that order. Password hash is the preferred, then PTA, federation really not very popular anymore. Again, as I kind of showed, the PTA, the federation, do have an advantage over the password hash, the cloud authentication, if it has restricted hours, if the account is disabled, if it is locked out. Those types of things will surface because it's authenticating against the actual domain controller. But hopefully I showed the tokens. It matters a bit less anyway. Authorization is always against Azure AD. Again, authentication, I could maybe shift somewhere else to a federation, to a domain controller. Authorization, when I'm accessing an app, that's always going to be against Azure AD. Federation, I could do an initial policy for that first authentication, but it's not being used for subsequent ones. So there's really not a lot of point putting a lot of effort into that. I really want to hit the policy every time it tries to authorize to do something. So roles and administrative units. So we've stood up Azure AD. We've stood up our Azure AD. We've done a custom name. We've done Azure AD Connect. We've got that all up and running. Our objects are there. There are many, many built-in roles for both Azure AD and the Microsoft SaaS solutions like Office 365 Dynamics. So they're just built into Azure Active Directory. So if I go and jump over and look, if I go to my Azure AD, I can see roles and administrators. And there's a whole bunch of different roles. And you can see there's ones here about Power BI. I can see ones about Power Platform. There's things like Global Administrator. Global Administrator is kind of the big one, kind of do anything you want. There's all these different roles. And essentially a role, let's just kind of pick one of these things. I don't know. I'll just pick one fairly randomly. Search Administrator, I've never even looked at this. We can look at the description. Oh, if I selected it correctly. Oh, now I broke it. Let's use the mouse then. So Search Administrator. If we select that, I can look at the description. And what it's going to show me here are all of the role permissions that it actually has. So I can kind of see, okay, so it has Office 365 Message Center, Messages Read, Content Manage. There's a whole set of basics. So each of these different permissions are part of the role. And then I would assign that role to a certain principal. So I can add an assignment. I could say who I want to assign it to. And it will show me all of the things that are eligible. Now, by default, it doesn't show groups. I cannot assign roles to groups. But you're saying, wait a minute, yeah, most of these are users, I agree, but there were some groups there. So very recently, Microsoft added the ability to have a special type of group that I can assign roles to. Now, to do this, when you actually create the group, I'll jump over just for a second. If I go and add a new group, there's actually this new option. Azure AD roles can be assigned to the group. Only groups that were created with that can then be used for role assignments. You'll see it grays out the type. It has to be assigned. I have to manually put users in. It's all about security. The reason we can't just use ordinary groups is, well, who knows who has what permissions to them? Then suddenly I'm giving them a role and they can elevate their permissions. It's a very touchy subject to give these kind of Azure AD level roles to groups. So I have to create this special type of group. It's in preview right now. There's limits on who can create those, who can change those. But then technically, yes, I could give a role to that kind of group. So that's the idea. All of these roles you're seeing here are Azure AD wide. It will really apply to everything. And they're just a group of permissions. Now, I can create custom roles now. If the ones that are built in don't match my requirements, I can go and create some new role. I could clone a custom role that I already had. I can start from scratch. And then I'll actually go and select, well, what permissions do I actually want to be in this thing? So I'll say, hey, permissions, and I can go through and check, hey, it needs this one, this one, this one, etc. So I can go ahead and create custom roles and then grant that, again, primarily to users. But I do have those special types of groups as well. So here's that kind of give it to users, special type group, create custom roles. Always think least privilege. Sure, if I give someone global administrator, I'm sure they can do whatever task I need them to do in Azure AD or Office 365, but I've given them way more than what they actually need. What do they actually need to do the job? That is the role I should assign. Now, the scope is normally global. It applies to everything. There is a new concept called administrative units. Now, the idea of administrative units is, if you think about, remember I said Azure AD is essentially flat. There aren't OUs like there is in Azure in regular Active Directory. So I have my Azure AD, and fundamentally, it's just full of various objects. I can have users in there, and I might have groups as well. So I've got a certain group that has maybe that user and that user in it. Now, one of the things I can now create is an administrative unit. So I'll create AU1. In AU1, I can add users to it, and I can add groups to it. So let's say this is group 1. So now I can manage that group. It does not add the users from the group into it for management. So what I mean by that is I can now give someone, maybe it's this user, the ability to manage that administrative unit. So now it can manage whatever role I give it for the things in that administrative unit. So those users and that group. I can add and remove users from that group. But the members of the group do not fall under the scope of my control. The group is there. I can change the membership, but I can't manage those two people. If it worked that way, it would be a huge security danger, because what I could do is, if the users in the group fell under my management as well, I could go and add users into the group so I could manage them. I could go and add an administrator into the group so then I could go and reset their password and take control. So yes, I can add groups into administrative units, but the people in the group don't fall within the control, if that makes sense. I have to directly put users in the administrative unit if I want to manage them. I can't just add a group and everyone in the group falls under my management. So if I was to go and look at administrative units, I've created 2. If I look at the Justice League, I've added 4 users. I've also added a group called Heroes Group. If we look at Heroes Group has Thor Odin's son in that group. So, okay, so under there I've got 4 users I can manage and a group with Thor in it. And then I can grant certain roles. This is preview, it's limited today. But for user administrator, I've given Clark Kent user administrator. So that means I can do things like reset passwords. So if I now act as Clark Kent and I go to users, I can see all these different users. I could remember Bruce Wayne was added directly. I could go to Bruce Wayne and I could say, hey, reset password. And I can absolutely do that. Fantastic. Now remember, Thor was a member of a group that I'm managing. So if I now go to Thor and I say reset password, it says you can't. I don't have permission. So that's kind of proving that whole point, that when I add groups, I could manage that group now. I could absolutely, as Clark Kent, we wish, but I could go to groups, I could go to hero group, and I could now change membership. I can add members, I can do things to that group. But just because they're in that group doesn't make them within the scope of the administrative unit. It just means I can manage the group. So this is a nice way now that I can divide up the management. I might have different business units and I want someone to be able to maybe do a help desk administration just for each business unit. I can do that by creating an administrative unit for each business group, add the users and any groups that I want them to be able to manage, assign someone a role. That role is now scoped at the administrative unit, not the whole Azure AD. And I can have many administrative units, and this is not placement, this is just kind of adding. So I can have the same users in multiple administrative units. That is not a problem. And then I have someone different, maybe managing this one. I have a certain role scoped. So that would be AU2, not kind of AU1. So that's what administrative units let me do. I can now assign those roles in a limited scope as opposed to my entire Azure Active Directory. So that's super, super powerful. The other nice thing I can do, imagine I've got like branch offices. So it gives me access to this new mystaff.microsoft.com. Now this is again in preview. So now what I can do is we'll start off looking as me. So if I go in, because it's in preview, I can go to kind of user settings. I can manage user feature previews. And I can see I've now got this My Staff at the bottom corner. So here now I can turn that on and give people access to this My Staff thing. And what that lets me do is now, as Clark, I can go to mystaff.microsoft.com. Imagine I was a branch manager, and I don't really know a lot about Azure AD. I don't want to use the regular portal. So now I can go and say, oh, look, I've got these things. I have some administrative units for. I can now go to them. I could select a user. I could reset the passwords. But the same restrictions apply. Hey, Avengers, well, I can see it, but I can't actually go and reset the password. I can't do anything to that particular user. Okay, so that was giving roles that were permanently assigned. Privileged identity management. Now, this is a P2 feature. It enables me to be given a role that I can elevate up to for a limited time only when I need it. So I'm pre-assigning it. The user can then go and say, hey, I now want to use it and elevate up. So it's on demand. I can do it for a future time. It is P2. I can do it for both Azure AD roles and Azure Resource Manager roles. So if I jump over for a second and I look at kind of me, if I go and search for PIM, we can see I can do things like Azure AD roles. I can go and look at the settings, for example. And what I could say is, hey, things like, let's kind of pick a big one. So we say global administrator. So I can say, hey, look, for global administrator, notice I can say, hey, what's the maximum duration? I can say if justification is required. I can say if MFA is required, if I need approval first before I can use it. I can also do assignments. Assignments say, hey, it's just going to be active as of now. So I can do that for Azure AD roles. I can also do it for Azure resources at a subscription resource group level as well. And then the end user experience is I would then grant people those roles. And then I would say, hey, look, my roles, if I actually want to use it, I would go and select it and say, hey, I want to activate. I could go ahead, put in a reason for that. I could do it for now, or I could say, hey, I want to start this in the future, set a certain time. I'd put in a reason, demo this, but for right now, I'll just do it for me. And I'll say activate. So it's validating that I've actually done that elevation up. It's going to keep trying until it's completed that process. It's going to refresh right here every 5 seconds. But once that's done, I now have that new role. I can now do things with those additional privileges for however long that was. So at this point, I would now have, so it's refreshing the browser to get the new access token, remember, because now it's got a different set of permissions on it. And if I go and look at my active assignments, I can see I've got my Teams Service Administrator activated. If I finish my tasks early, well, rather than wait 3 hours, I can just say, hey, go ahead and deactivate it. But I actually gave myself, so again, someone had to allocate me that role in advance. But then once I've been allocated it, I choose when to turn it on. And it can make things like do the MFA. If I hadn't already done a strong authentication and I'd made that require MFA, at the point I did that elevation, it would make me do that strong authentication before I got it. So that's super useful. So ordinarily, I can just do a regular authentication. But then if I try and do something that's more important, it will make me go and do that strong auth before it gives me kind of that higher set of credentials. So it's super, super powerful. Very much recommended. Again, it's a P2. So MFA. Everyone knows passwords on their own really not very good. We're trying to move away from that. There's been a number of studies lately, but I think they've found that 99.9% of attacks could be stopped if you just had MFA. So what is MFA? Well, it's multiple factors for my authentication. We're used to kind of something I know. I put in a password. That's something I know. A PIN is something I know. So it's something we know. It could be a gesture doing a little weird thing on the start screen. Something we are, a thumbprint, a 3D map of our face. Something we have, our phone, maybe an oath token. But something that could be our laptop ourselves, our desktop machine. Something like Hello for Business uses that as something we have. So it's something we know, something we are, or something we have. And I'm going to want two of those. It's multiple factors. We want to use this sparingly though. So we need to be intelligent. If we require MFA every time we try and do anything, we get muscle memory. Oh, I did something, click, yes, it was me, yes, it was me, yes, it was me. So if even a bad person is doing something, can we see a prompt for MFA? Oh yeah, it's probably me, click yes. I want MFA if there's some heightened detection of risk. I want MFA if, hey, I'm accessing something that's more secure. I'm doing a PIM elevation. I'm accessing this secure application. That's the recommendation for MFA. Don't just constantly bombard people for MFA. They'll just get muscle memory and accept it. The recommendation is I detect there's some anomalous behavior, something different. That's when I require MFA. Now that's when things like identity protection, another P2 feature, is so powerful because identity protection can detect those kind of risk behaviors. Now, it is part of Azure AD P1. So to actually get this, I need to do Azure AD P1, or I can turn on security defaults. If I'm just free SKU, there's something called security defaults that will make people register for MFA, and it will make them MFA if I do things like the Azure portal or PowerShell or CLI. I can turn that on. So if I actually go, and I'll see if I can remember this. I'm probably not going to remember where this is exactly, but I think it's under security. I've lost security. Who am I logged? Oh, I'm logged on as Clark. That's why I can't see it. So I have to go on as me. Go to my Azure AD. I can go to my security. And then from my security, I can kind of do my authentication methods. Actually, this is not the right place, but I'll actually show this. This is password protection. So this is the capability where, hey, by default, it will block easy passwords. That's kind of global list. But if I think it's P1 or above, I can actually do custom. So words that may be in Texas, cowboy. I don't want Savile in there. So any variation of those, swapping an O for a 0, all those things will be blocked as well. So I can do these kind of custom. And I can even integrate this with Active Directory. So domain controllers on-prem would also enforce these same kind of protections. But to actually turn on the secure defaults, let's try properties. We'll get there eventually. Manage security defaults at the bottom. And that's where you can see on the right, I've got this enable security defaults. So over here, I could say, hey, yes. Now again, if I have P1, I'm not going to do this. I'd much rather use conditional access to drive MFA. If I only had free, then obviously that's better than nothing. So I could go ahead here and turn on those security defaults so people would at least be able to do a very, very basic set of circumstances where it would drive MFA requirements. Hello for Business is also a strong authentication. Remember, Hello for Business is on my device. I have my trusted platform module, my TPM. I have a private cert in there. That is then used for the authentication. Now you might wonder, how is that a strong authentication? Because if you think about it, well, I've kind of got my machine. I've got my TPM in here. This is where I'm storing kind of that private cert. To get to that, I have to type in a PIN. So that's something I know, and I have the machine. Something I know and something I have. And then in the kind of AD or Azure AD, obviously there's hybrid versions of this. It kind of has the public cert side of that. It does a certain cryptographic operation to actually get the authentication. People often don't like pins. They say pins is easier to guess than a password. How is a pin more secure than a password? Remember, if I have a password, that's what we call a network secret. I can use it anywhere. I can use that password on this machine, that machine, that machine, the machine over there, that VPN connection. I can use it anywhere I want. PIN is unique to that device. So it's more secure than something I can use anywhere. I have to have that machine to use that PIN. So Windows Hello for Business, where it uses these certificates, these keys for the authentication, is a strong authentication because I have to know the PIN or the biometric to unlock the device. And then it's using, I have the machine for the TPM to actually then go and do the authentication. So Hello for Business is a strong authentication that essentially is an MFA. I don't have to do something else. So for the Azure AD MFA, there are kind of different versions available. So here, this document is great. It talks about, hey, where I can use it. And essentially here, we can see, look, if I'm doing the Azure AD free, then, well, I have to use the mobile application as the second factor. So there's the Microsoft Authenticator app. It has to use that. If I'm a global admin in Azure AD, then I can also use the phone or SMS. They want to help protect the global administrators. Additionally, I can do the same thing if I have Microsoft 365. I can also then go and use SMS, a text message, a phone call, notification, etc. If I have P1 or P2, that's where I get the full gambit of all the options. I can drive it by conditional access. I can customize the greetings. I can get full reports. I can have trusted IP addresses. I can even do MFA for on-premises applications through various types of proxy service. So that gives me kind of the full set. But that's really walking through what all those various options are. But definitely, we really want to be using MFA. If you don't have license for it, at least do the security defaults, get something going. What about a third-party MFA? So I've got a Duo, for example, or RSA. So this is evolving right now. Now today, there are something called custom controls that can integrate with conditional access. But it's moving to a new implementation that will bring third-party MFA more in line with what I can do with Azure MFA, like those elevation type things. Again, it's in progress right now. It's changing. Today, third-party MFA cannot do everything I can do with Azure AD MFA. If I want to use Azure AD MFA from on-premise, like Radius, for example, well, there's actually an add-on for Network Policy Server that lets me use Azure AD MFA as part of an authentication to Radius via that extension for MPS. One of the challenges with MFA is always, well, someone's got a password and they have to register for MFA. What's to stop the bad guy getting the password and registering the MFA? So what we have recommended now is a combination registration for both MFA and self-service password reset. Self-service password reset is, hey, I forgot my password, I need to reset it. And most of the factors are the same. There's a few differences. like the self-service password reset. I can do an email. I can answer challenge questions. I can't do that for MFA. But there's a lot of overlap, like phone numbers, etc. So this is a new kind of combined place to go and set this stuff up, to go and register. But what I can say is, look, to do this initial registration, I'm going to make you be in a lockdown status. Now, this is a P1 feature because it's conditional access. But what I can now do with conditional access, I'm going to show this in a second, just overall conditional access. But now there's a certain type of action with conditional access. If I create a new policy, if I go and look at the app, there's user actions. Hey, look, there's this really nice over here. If I'm registering my security information, this policy is going to apply. And then what I might do is, well, look, I'm going to grant this only if, you can see on the right-hand side, well, only if it's hybrid. It's only if it's on a corporate device. Maybe only if it's marked as compliant. So I can start to now lock down where you can do that initial MFA registration from. So that's actually kind of a super, super powerful thing. So use that. And then users can go to this kind of password reset.microsoftonline.com. It's available via My Apps. It's available if you try and authenticate and you forgot your password. All of those things are going to show. And for that password reset configuration, if I actually just go to the domain, discard that, you'll actually see password reset. And here I can say, well, what options are available? Hey, look, app code, email, phone, security questions. You can set how many are required to actually reset. What are the security questions? You can add your own custom ones. So least favorite food, obviously anything green will be the answer to that. But you can go and add all these kind of different things that users will go and register and then can be used as part of kind of that self-service password reset. And again, if you're P1, you can actually then go and write that back to on-prem. So you change password because I forgot it, but it will go and write it back to on-prem as well. This is the huge thing, conditional access. I've got a whole separate video on this, so I'm not going to go into a huge detail here. The point of this, any authorization against Azure AD is going to trigger if I've set up a policy for it. So it provides rich sets of controls around which users, which roles, are they a guest, what app are they trying to access, what's their environment. It is a P1 feature. So if we go and look at this super quickly, the whole point is to go to security. Now there are some nice things I can do in here. So you can see here there's that continuous access evaluation I talked about, where I can turn that on to it if my access token is valid. Things like SharePoint and Exchange can go and check. But what I'm focusing on is conditional access. I can do things like terms of use. I can create PDF documents that a user will see as part of their authentication. They have to kind of accept. I can set it up in different languages. So I've got English, for example. And the point of those terms of use is I can then use them, part of my policy. I can create locations. This could be based on IP addresses. That is my public facing IP for my network address translation. It could be based on countries. So there's standard blocks of IPs per country. And then I can use those in the policies. So if I look at a fairly standard policy I might have, we'll just look at, hey, client apps. So we have, well, who does it apply to? Is it certain groups of users? Is it all users? Is it only guests and external users? Is it certain roles? I can drill down into certain groups, so I have control. I can exclude people. So this might be super useful when I'm testing. I don't want to risk locking out my administrators by mistake. So always be careful with all users. So I might exclude cloud admins originally. I can pick what apps. It could be all apps. It could be specific ones. I can search all of the apps I've registered, federated apps. All the ones I have are going to show. So I select the apps this is going to apply to. I can exclude. If I did all apps, I could exclude certain apps. I can drive conditions. So in these risk ones, this is identity protection. So I have to be P2. So I've got, hey, what is my user risk? Sign-in risk. So if there's a heightened risk, then I'm going to apply this policy. I can target certain platforms. Windows. If it's Windows Phone, that's going to be super suspicious. I could exclude certain platforms. Location is a little bit dangerous. Most of the time now we have zero trust, but I could potentially say, look, I'm going to exclude selected locations. If it's my office, I'm going to exclude this policy. I know it's coming from this IP. That's my NAT IP address to get outbound. I'm going to exclude that. Again, it's not your internal IP address range. That's typically meaningless. It's the IP that's facing Azure, where the request is coming from. That's going to be your network address translation. I can target certain types of app. Is it an active sync? Is it legacy? Is it a browser? The device state. This can come from things like Intune. That's about if it's compliant. Then I have control. So based on all of these different things, what do I want to do? Well, I can make you do an MFA. I can make it be marked as compliant, again, via kind of the Intune, Defender ATP. Is it hybrid Azure AD joins? Is it an approved client app? Things like Outlook client, etc. There might be an app protection policy. I require you to change your password. I require you to accept the terms of use I've created. And is it all of them or one of them? It's super common, for example, to maybe have require MFA or it be maybe marked as compliant. Either you're healthy and a compliant known managed device, or you do an MFA. There were also some additional controls around session. I can now make you check, so it's automatic to say, hey, I'm not going to make you say, hey, keep this for 14 days. I'm going to make it a persistent browser session. I'm going to make you reauth on a certain frequency. When I talked about the refresh token kind of lasts forever, maybe I want to kill some of that stuff off. I can make you re-sign in. Here it's telling you about that 90-day rolling window I mentioned. Well, I can make you re-authenticate. And there's other types of conditional access, app control, app enforce restrictions. There's all these different options available to me. And when I apply that policy, that's now going to kick in every time I try to get an access token. This is how we want to drive things like MFA. It gives us very, very granular controls. Use this. Now, I talked about users from AD going to Azure AD, but you may want to collaborate with users outside of your company. Often there are people in other companies I want to work with. And what I'm going to do commonly, if I'm collaborating with them, I'm going to add them as a guest. I can invite them as a guest to my Azure AD. So if we think about, hey, look, I've got my Azure AD, and my Azure AD is primarily populated by users from my AD. Great. They have all been replicated up through AAD Connect. And now those users live quite happily in here. But now, maybe there's a company I want to work with, they have their own Azure AD. Or maybe there's a company where it's just a user with a Microsoft account. Or maybe it's a company where it's a Gmail. Or maybe it's something else entirely and I can use a one-time passcode. Or maybe they're in some other kind of realm and I want to federate. I want to do kind of a SAML. I can do all of those things. So all of these types of objects I can add in as a B2B guest. So what happens is a kind of stub object gets created. It's not a full user. Now these little stub objects get created for all of the guests I add. But those stub objects can now be given permissions to anything that trusts the Azure AD, just like any other user. I can add them into groups. I can give them access to an Azure subscription. I can give them access to a SharePoint site. The authentication happens here. They're using their existing password. The exception is one-time passcode. This is where they're not part of any of these other things. Every time this person tries to authenticate, they will be emailed a passcode that they will type in as the password. What this guarantees is they still have access to the mailbox. So if they left the company, they would have lost the mailbox. They can't receive the one-time passcode anymore, so they can't authenticate. That's the point of one-time passcode. So any of these types of things I can add as guests. Those guests, well, I can now give them access to things. Authorization is happening here. So Alt Z here, Alt N, authentication there. MFA, remember, typically we trigger with conditional access, which is Alt Z. So MFA is happening here. Today, any MFA they've done here, we do not trust, even if it's another Azure AD. So if I had some conditional access that required MFA, they would have to set up Authenticator app or text or phone against my Azure AD. Now you may be wondering, wait a minute, that's a P1 or above feature. For every one user over here that is licensed for kind of P1 or P2, I can have 5 guest users use that feature. So if I had 100 users licensed for P1, I can have 500 guests using conditional access and MFA and all of that good stuff. So that's how we kind of drive that. And they just show up in our Azure AD. So here I can kind of see I've got various types of guests. Notice I've got a Yahoo. Well, that's kind of the identity issue, is multiple ones supported from that. I've got a Gmail, you can see here. So that's a Gmail, that's a Yahoo. I've got some that come from other Azure AD instances. So all of these types of things are possible. So I have different types of guests. So my Yahoo is obviously a one-time passcode. My Gmail, well, that's actually using a Gmail federation that you can add in. You can actually go and add Gmail as a kind of federation for your Azure AD instance. You have to go and create an app in Google, and then you can federate that with Azure AD, and now I can use Gmail. So I can add those as guests, and I'm now collaborating. The whole point of those things is now all of those guest objects can be given access to SharePoint Online and Azure subscriptions. I'm collaborating with them. That's the point of B2B. B2C is aimed that they're a customer. And I always use the example of when I was kind of on a diet once, and my wife went out and bought me cookie dough to try and sabotage me. We were on a competition. And when you went to the cookie dough site, it was fantastic. I was like, I need more cookie dough. And at the cookie dough site, it gave me kind of the option to say, hey, you want to buy more cookie dough? So, hey, cookies. Do you want to sign in with kind of your Twitter account or LinkedIn? Or you can actually go and create an account. So it's a different set of identities than we think about with B2B. It's more a whole set of social identities. Or I can actually go ahead and create an account. So this is B2C, business to consumer, my customer. This is where I'm not collaborating with them. I don't want to use Azure, give them permission to Azure subscriptions or SharePoint documents. I'm writing some application that is going to use it. So this is a different type of tenant today. It's a special B2C type. I would then write my application to use this for the authentication, and then it will take care. I can customize it completely. They say customize every pixel. I can customize the flow of that. I can customize what data it's storing, but it uses all of the social types. So here, if I actually go and change my directory, and I'll switch this, so I've created a B2C. So just like anything else, I can say, hey, I want to create a resource. And in this case, I'd be creating a B2C. So I want to create an Azure AD B2C. I'd hit create. and then I'd create a new B2C tenant. I'd give it a name, etc., just like I did before. Once I've done that, I'm going to abandon it. Once I create one, I could then change over to my B2C instance. This is completely different. Now from within here, I could go home, and then I can actually look at the B2C instances I have. So there's my Azure AD B2C. And here, so I can customize everything about this, but you'll notice the identity providers, look at all the different types of identity provider I can turn on. So yes, I can have local accounts, and I can configure what does it use for kind of the primary identifier, but I can also use any of these types of kind of social provider for my B2C instance. I can also add others. I can customize the flows, I can do all these, I can have MFAs. And the way this is built, it's actually built on a number of authentications and number of MFAs. Doesn't matter how many objects you have, it's just built on, there's a certain amount you get for free, it's actually quite a lot for free. So this may cost me nothing if I'm a fairly small app, but it's really based on the idea of how many auths and how many MFAs. That's how it's built. So it's a completely different Azure AD tenant. I'd write my app, but there are some changes coming. There's a kind of goal that there shouldn't be a difference between what I can do with B2B and B2C, so that there were some things happening in the future. We're starting to see some of it, but for today, if it's my customer, B2C. If I'm collaborating with them, B2B. Trying to close up, this is a really long lesson. Access reviews, this is super, super powerful. And I didn't mention it into B2B. One of the things I can do is entitlement management. I can actually create packages to say, hey, rather than me inviting people as guests via B2B, I can actually set up packages. Let's say, hey, this SharePoint site and this group membership and this app. And I can whitelist to say, hey, if you're coming from this domain, you're automatically approved. So those people I collaborate with can actually auto bring themselves in as guests. Access reviews, the idea of this is if you think about over time, I change role, I get different permissions. Do I ever lose the old ones? I have guests, I give them a role, I give them an app, I give them a group membership. Do I ever take it away? So access reviews enable me to do reviews based on group memberships, app assignments, and role assignments. The review can be done by an administrator, by delegated people, or even a self-review. I can say, hey, as a one-time or as a periodic thing, I need you to go and review and confirm you still need this role, still need this app, still need this group membership. This is a P2 feature, but it's super powerful if you have like audits and want to confirm someone still needs something. Access reviews enable me to do this. Final thing, what about regular Active Directory? It's still there, so we're not going anywhere. The good old Active Directory domain service is going to probably be with us for a really long time. Now, there is something called Azure AD Domain Services. The point of Azure AD Domain Services is, imagine I've created an Azure AD, maybe I'm a new company. So I just started fresh. I just created Azure AD. I don't need a regular AD. My desktops, I'm using modern management. My modern management is I Azure AD join it. I'm being managed by Intune for my sort of app, etc. My patches come from Windows Update. My policy comes from Intune, my apps. I don't need regular AD, I can do modern management. Great, and then I create my Azure subscription. I've got my virtual network. I've got my VM, and my VM has this app that requires good old AD. It requires Kerberos. It requires NTLM. It requires LDAP. What do I do? So Azure AD Domain Services is not designed to replace AD. It's designed that I'm in this scenario, or maybe I can't extend my AD to the cloud. What it does is it projects into the one VNet in one region today, Active Directory Domain Services. It essentially creates two DCs that are fully managed. You have no access to them. I have no access to like powerful roles. I can create some basic group policy objects, but the objects replicate down from here into that Active Directory. If I create users in the AD, they do not replicate back to Azure AD. It's a managed AD designed for, hey, I have some requirement for Kerberos, for NTLM, for LDAP, ADSI, whatever that might be, that I can't do with native Azure AD. So it's going to create these two domain controllers that it manages, it populates. To do this, I have to have, if these were replicated from AD, I must have password hash. But that's what Azure AD Domain Services is. It's a managed Active Directory today in a single region, really designed that I have some requirement around kind of Kerberos, NTLM, LDAP, that I just can't do with regular Azure AD. If I had regular AD down here, well, I probably wouldn't use Azure AD Domain Services. What I'd most likely do is extend AD into the cloud. So how do we extend AD into the cloud? So imagine we have our Azure subscription. And remember, we've created our virtual network. Remember, what is Active Directory? Active Directory is fundamentally personified by one or more domain controllers that run a whole bunch of AD services and DNS most of the time. So to use it, I have to be able to find it. So I have to be able to resolve the DNS. Then I have to be able to talk via a variety of different ports and protocols. It's the IP. I have to be able to get to it. So that's the requirement. So if I wanted to extend my AD to the cloud, well, firstly, option one is this is kind of a network. I have to have a connection between this network and that network. That could be ExpressRoute, private peering. That could be a site-to-site VPN. Then I would change the VNet to use custom DNS and point to those domain controllers. Because ExpressRoute, private peering, or site-to-site VPN has now given me an IP path. So now I just be able to resolve the DNS service records to find the actual IPs of the DCs, and now I can talk to them. At that point, I've extended Active Directory to the cloud. Now, very often, I'll take a next step. I'll actually create domain controllers in the virtual networks. Maybe I've got a hub and spoke, whatever that is. So now my custom DNS would instead point to these. They would have reserved IP addresses. I'd probably create a separate site, so that'd be an IP range of the network. I'd create a site in AD. I'd create a site link so my replication works the right way. So now machines in here that require AD will go and talk locally. I might move my Azure AD Connect into here over time. And there's some caveats right now around FSMO roles and putting them in AD because of the way VM generation ID works. But eventually, I might move my FSMO roles into here as well. But that's how I get things AD integrated in Azure. You're probably still going to need it. Now, the other thing you're probably going to want to then do is, well, okay, how do I join? So I can automatically join the machines. And the way I can do this is to join the domain, I need a credential. I don't want to hard code a credential in a script. So Azure has something called Key Vault. Key Vault is secure and I can have secrets. So I would have a secret that is kind of the credential, the username and the password I want to use. I would then enable the use for ARM templates. I'm going to cover all of this in detail when we talk about infrastructure as code. But the point is, there is an extension. This extension I can apply to VMs as I provision them. And this extension is a domain join. And I just have to give it kind of a domain name, an OU path, the user, and protected is the password. And what I can now do is in the parameters, that password is a reference to a Key Vault instance and this secret. So nowhere is the password stored in any configuration file. It's stored securely in a Key Vault. At deployment time, I, as the user doing the deployment, have rights to read that secret. It will go and reference the secret from the key vault, bring it in, use it in the extension, and automatically join my VM to my domain. So that really kind of completes that overall picture that during provisioning, my ARM template or Terraform, whatever I use, would reference the secret, use the extension to join the domain, and all good times. This was a huge lesson. I didn't mean for it to be this long. I apologize, but I hope this was useful. Let's go and get to the questions, and thank you for watching.